In 1941, as war consumed Europe, a quiet stretch of farmland in Michigan became the focus of an experiment that few believed possible. Henry Ford, the man who once mechanized the automobile, announced he would now mass-produce bombers, not by the dozen, but one every hour. Surveyors arrived in Ypsilanti Township, driving stakes into cornfields that still shimmered with late summer grain. Locals watched with disbelief as Ford engineers spoke of hangars, furnaces, and an assembly line nearly a mile long. Even officials in Washington doubted that aircraft could ever be built like cars. The challenge seemed beyond engineering, beyond reason. Yet within 2 years, steel and glass had replaced the crops. The Willow Run plant rose from the soil, a city of machines that worked without pause. Inside, thousands of men and women built the B-24 Liberator, the heavy bomber that would carry the war deep into enemy territory. From plowshares to propellers, the transformation stunned the world. In a land once known for harvests, a new kind of field had emerged, one that produced aircraft instead of grain. How did America turn a Michigan cornfield into the largest bomber plant on Earth, and in doing so, redefine the meaning of industrial power? In 1940, the United States stood apart from the war raging overseas. Europe burned under German bombs, and Britain struggled alone. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw the danger ahead and called for America to become the arsenal of democracy. The challenge was clear: to build weapons faster than the Axis could destroy them. But the nation's aircraft industry was still small, its factories unprepared for the scale modern war demanded. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was chosen as the main heavy bomber for long-range missions. Its speed and payload promised to match any enemy aircraft, yet its design was complex, requiring thousands of precision parts. Consolidated's plants in California and Texas could not meet the orders flooding in from the War Department. The government turned to Detroit, the home of Ford Motor Company, a symbol of industrial speed and organization. Henry Ford's record spoke for itself. He had transformed car making into an exact science, using continuous flow and interchangeable parts. When officials asked if he could mass-produce bombers, Ford replied that what could be built by hand could be built by machine. His chief production engineer, Charles "Cast Iron Charlie" Sorensen, was equally confident. During a trip to San Diego in early 1941, Sorensen studied the B-24's construction and spent one sleepless night sketching a plan for a moving assembly line on hotel stationery. The idea was radical: an aircraft built like a car, rolling forward through stations of specialized labor. Critics in Washington called it reckless. Aviation engineers insisted that aircraft required craftsmanship, not conveyor belts. But Ford's management believed precision could be multiplied. The decision was made. Ford would build a factory large enough to prove it. In April 1941, Ford purchased nearly 1,000 acres of farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. The site was flat, open, and near the company's existing supply network. Architect Albert Kahn designed the structure, a single immense hall of glass and steel, more than a mile long, equipped for a continuous line of bomber production. Construction began immediately, turning fields of corn into foundations of concrete. Within months, thousands of workers poured into the site. Roads, power lines, and housing projects sprang up overnight. From the air, the complex resembled an industrial city taking shape. It was called Willow Run. No one could yet imagine that this quiet agricultural region would soon produce bombers faster than any factory in history. The calm before the storm had ended. America's war machine was beginning to awaken, not on the battlefield, but in the fields of Michigan, where the first pieces of the arsenal of democracy were being laid in steel and sweat. By mid-1941, the foundations of Willow Run had begun to rise. The flat cornfields west of Detroit were now a maze of cranes, concrete, and steel. Ford's vision to turn farmland into a bomber plant was taking physical form, an immense structure unlike anything built before. Yet behind the optimism lay a mountain of difficulties. Ford Motor Company knew how to mass-produce cars. Aircraft were another world. Henry Ford demanded perfection and speed. His system depended on uniform parts and a steady rhythm of machines. Aircraft, however, required hand-fitting, fine tolerances, and intricate wiring. The difference in scale and precision caused tension from the start. Consolidated Aircraft, designer of the B-24 Liberator, feared Ford's methods would sacrifice quality for volume. Ford's engineers, led by Charles Sorensen, argued that without mass production, the United States would never meet wartime demand. After long negotiations, Washington allowed Ford to proceed under close supervision, the greatest industrial gamble of the war. The site itself became a monument to ambition. Albert Kahn's design stretched nearly a mile in length and covered more than 60 acres under one roof. The floor plan followed a single flowing line. Materials entered from one end and completed aircraft rolled out the other. At the building's southern corner, the line turned sharply, a symbolic detail forced by Ford's refusal to pay higher taxes across the county border. The building's long L shape would soon become famous, visible even to pilots circling overhead. The next challenge was manpower. Ford required tens of thousands of workers for a job no one had done before. Recruiters scoured Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana for mechanics, welders, and clerks. Many of the new hires were farmers or small-town residents with no experience in aviation. Intensive training programs began immediately. In warehouses and schools, instructors taught riveting, blueprint reading, and the language of aircraft assembly. The transformation from farmhand to factory worker became part of the war effort itself. As America edged closer to conflict, the plant's pace accelerated. Machinery from Ford's River Rouge works arrived daily: presses, cranes, and conveyor systems. Rail lines were laid to deliver aluminum, engines, and landing gear from suppliers nationwide. Sorensen personally oversaw the coordination, moving through the site with a stopwatch and clipboard, timing every motion. He was relentless, a man known for sleeping in his office and firing foremen who failed to meet his standards. Then, in December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. The United States was now at war. The urgency that followed electrified Willow Run. Military orders multiplied overnight. Construction crews worked in blizzards to close the roof and install heating before winter deepened. The plant, still unfinished, began to assemble test airframes using wooden mock-ups and spare parts. In the early months of 1942, the first B-24 components began moving down the experimental line. The results were mixed. Ford's workers adapted quickly, but aircraft tolerances left no room for error. The first prototypes required extensive rework, and consolidated inspectors rejected several assemblies outright. Newspapers questioned whether Ford's dream had been too bold, yet Sorensen refused to slow down. He broke the bomber into modular sections: fuselage, wings, tail, and nose, each built in parallel before joining on the main line. Gradually, the rhythm took hold. Each week the line grew longer, more precise. Aluminum sheets became fuselage shells. Skeletal wings turned solid with wiring and hydraulics. By late summer 1942, the first complete Liberator rolled from the hangar. Workers crowded the runway as its engines roared to life. When it lifted into the gray Michigan sky, a cheer broke through the factory's constant noise. It was not yet a triumph, but it proved the impossible could be done. Still, the plant's problems were far from solved. The complexity of the bomber and the inexperience of the workforce meant constant delays. Some components arrived late, others had to be redesigned to fit Ford's assembly jigs. Production crawled where speed was promised. Sorensen called emergency meetings almost nightly. The pressure mounted. Every lost hour meant fewer bombers for the front. By the end of 1942, however, the system began to stabilize. Over 20,000 employees now filled Willow Run, operating around the clock in 3 shifts. The rural quiet of Ypsilanti had vanished, replaced by traffic, smoke, and the constant rumble of engines under test. Cafeterias, dormitories, and bus lines formed a small city around the plant. The workers, men, women, and newcomers from every background, shared a single purpose: to keep the line moving. When the year closed, America was fully mobilized. The U.S. Army Air Forces demanded bombers for Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. Willow Run was no longer an experiment or a gamble. It had become the nation's front line of production. The cornfields that once fed Michigan now fed the Allied war effort. Each rivet driven, each wing assembled, each engine tested was part of a greater machine, the industrial war America had sworn to win. And as the snow fell outside, the plant's lights burned through the night, signaling the beginning of a new kind of battlefield, one fought not with weapons, but with steel, labor, and resolve. By early 1943, Willow Run stood complete, a mile of concrete, glass, and steel on the flat Michigan plain. The plant consumed more electricity than any nearby city and drew in trains by the dozen each day. From above, its vast L-shaped roof cut across the farmland like a new border between peace and war. Inside, an army of workers filled the aisles, and the sound never stopped. Rivet guns, cranes, forklifts, and loudspeakers blended into one continuous rhythm. The first Liberators to emerge from the line were imperfect. The learning curve had been brutal. Components failed to fit, engines misaligned, and inspection teams from the Army Air Forces returned aircraft for rework. Ford engineers, led by Charles Sorensen, refused to yield. They tore up the early layout, rebuilt jigs, and reorganized the workflow into a steady sequence of motion. Slowly, the chaos began to resemble precision. Sorensen's new method divided the bomber into modules, fuselage, wings, and tail sections, each built in subplants and fed into the main line at exact intervals. The assembly never stopped moving. When a mistake appeared, it was corrected in motion. He called it flow production, a principle borrowed from Ford's automobile plants but refined under wartime urgency. By spring, the process produced a finished bomber every few hours. To sustain that pace, Willow Run employed more than 40,000 people. Many were women replacing men who had gone overseas. They became the Rosies of the home front, young, determined, and learning at speed. In training halls, instructors taught them how to rivet aluminum, wire electrical panels, and read blueprints. Within months, their work matched that of seasoned mechanics. Each shift, they filled the factory floor in waves, day, evening, and night 7 days a week. Life at Willow Run was exhausting but driven by purpose. Posters on the walls reminded everyone that each rivet counted. Bulletin boards displayed photographs from Europe and the Pacific. For many women, the job was personal. The bombers they built might one day protect a brother or husband. In the noise of the plant, patriotism was not spoken. It was hammered into metal. The magnitude of production forced Ford to expand beyond the main building. Entire rail networks were laid to transport subassemblies from Detroit and Dearborn. Each B-24 required over 1 million parts. Supply delays could halt the line, so warehouses operated day and night to ensure a constant stream of aluminum, engines, and landing gear. Sorensen introduced an internal rail system with electric carts and conveyors, a city of motion within walls. By mid-1943, Willow Run was operating with military precision. The line moved faster each month. In August, the plant completed one bomber every 100 minutes. By December, the time dropped to just over 60 minutes, exactly what Ford had promised 2 years earlier. Headlines across the country read, "A bomber every hour." Each Liberator rolled out gleaming silver under the hangar lights. 4 Pratt & Whitney R1 1830 twin Wasp engines hung beneath the wings, each delivering over 1,200 horsepower. The aircraft weighed 36,000 pounds empty, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs across 2,000 miles. Test pilots from the Army Air Forces took off directly from the plant's runway, circling over the Michigan fields before heading for final delivery depots. For workers, every takeoff felt like a victory. Some paused during their shift to watch a new bomber rise into the sky. The sound of its engines became the heartbeat of the home front. In those moments, exhaustion vanished. They had built something larger than themselves, a weapon that would cross oceans. Beyond the plant, a new town had risen almost overnight. Bomber City, a government-built housing project nearby, hosted more than 15,000 residents. Buses ran around the clock. Cafeterias served meals for 3 shifts. Families lived by the rhythm of production. Even children measured time by the siren that marked each hour a bomber was completed. The war, however, demanded more than machines. The cost of speed was constant strain. Temperatures inside the plant swung from freezing in winter to unbearable heat in summer. The pace injured thousands. Crushed fingers, burns, and exhaustion were common. Yet absentee rates remained low. Workers knew their labor was part of something decisive. By early 1944, Willow Run had become the largest single manufacturing site on Earth. Ford's industrial empire stretched from ore and rubber shipments to completed bombers taking flight. The War Production Board hailed the plant as a national symbol. Even President Roosevelt cited it as proof that democracy could outbuild dictatorship. In that year alone, Willow Run produced over 650 aircraft per month. The B-24s built there soon filled Allied airfields across Europe and the Pacific. They bombed refineries in Ploiesti, railway hubs in Germany, and supply routes in Burma. Many bore the signatures of workers on their panels, small pencil marks hidden under paint. Some never returned, but those that did carried the story of Michigan's cornfields to distant skies. As the war expanded, the workforce grew more diverse. African American workers from the South joined the line despite segregation and limited housing. Under federal pressure, Ford opened more positions, marking one of the first large-scale integrations in American industry. On the same floor, men and women of every background worked side by side, united by one rhythm, the movement of the line. Inside the plant, the scale defied imagination. Fuselages advanced nose to tail, wings swung into place by overhead cranes, and engines arrived already running from test stands. The ceiling trembled with the vibration of work. Engineers said the factory had become a living organism. It breathes aluminum and exhales bombers. But the rhythm came with sacrifice. Each minute counted, and each worker bore the weight of knowing that failure could cost lives abroad. Accidents were frequent, fatigue constant. Cafeterias served thousands of meals daily, yet the food was often cold before it reached the table. Few complained. "We had no right to be tired," one woman later recalled. "The boys at the front didn't rest either." By late 1944, Willow Run reached its peak. The plant now produced more bombers than all Axis factories combined. The assembly line stretched over a mile, and the final test runway buzzed day and night. When officials from the War Department visited that autumn, Sorensen guided them along the catwalks, timing each motion as he had from the beginning. When asked how he maintained such speed, he simply said, "We don't stop." Outside, snow fell across the runways, covering rows of completed bombers waiting for delivery. Inside, the heat of the machines melted it as fast as it landed. The contrast captured what Willow Run had become, a furnace of production in a nation at war. As 1945 approached, the tide of battle had turned. B-24s built in Michigan now escorted victory across Europe and Asia. But even as success drew near, the plant worked without pause. Workers sensed that the end was coming, yet the siren still sounded each hour. For them, the rhythm of war continued until the very last bomber left the line. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Willow Run had produced over 8,600 Liberators. The cornfields that once yielded crops had given the Allies air supremacy. More than a factory, Willow Run had become proof that industrial power, disciplined, organized, and unrelenting, could decide the outcome of war. When the final bomber lifted from its runway, the cheers were quiet. The work was done. The field of engines and rivets returned to silence, leaving behind the echo of machines that had once built victory from soil. By the opening months of 1945, the Willow Run plant had reached its zenith. The endless motion of cranes, engines, and rivet guns had become the pulse of America's war effort. Each day, another B-24 Liberator left the runway, carrying with it the labor of tens of thousands. From a distance, the factory seemed unstoppable, an industrial army in full stride. But beneath the triumph, fatigue, loss, and uncertainty began to spread. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Allied bombers now ruled the skies, and the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Liberators built in Michigan flew in massive formations over Germany, targeting refineries, bridges, and transportation hubs. Each sortie carried hundreds of aircraft, and each one bore a serial number linked to Willow Run's production logs. For the workers, the connection was personal. Newspapers listed aircraft lost over the Rhine or Vienna. Many silently traced the numbers, wondering if they had built those very machines. The cost was immense. In raids over Ploiesti and the Ruhr, dozens of B-24s failed to return. Crews vanished, leaving only serial numbers and coordinates. At Willow Run, telegrams arrived at nearby homes, brief notices that turned celebration into mourning. The workers continued their shifts, but the cheers that once greeted every takeoff grew softer. Each plane carried not just bombs, but memories of those who had built and flown its predecessors. Inside the plant, the strain was unrelenting. Shifts stretched to 12 hours. The heat from the machinery mixed with Michigan's winter cold, leaving workers drenched in sweat 1 hour and shivering the next. Many endured burns, fatigue, or injuries from repetitive labor. Yet few left their posts. Absenteeism remained among the lowest in the nation's defense industries. Patriotism, pride, and necessity kept the line alive. Charles Sorensen, the iron-willed engineer who had shaped Willow Run's system, now aged visibly under the pressure. The constant deadlines, government inspections, and maintenance of an operation that never slept had taken their toll. He admitted privately that each completed bomber came at the cost of another sleepless night. Ford executives struggled to balance morale and discipline. Every inspection carried the risk of penalties if a defect was found. Yet the machines kept moving, and the bombers kept flying. Outside the plant, rumors began to circulate. Germany's defeat was only months away, and production quotas were already being revised in Washington. Contracts would soon expire. For many workers, the factory was their first steady income. Returning to farms or towns meant facing an uncertain economy. Cafeteria conversations turned from aircraft schedules to post-war layoffs. The same system that had lifted entire communities was now preparing to shut itself down. In March 1945, the first signs of contraction appeared. Orders were cut, and certain assembly lines were idled. Storage yards filled with completed bombers awaiting transport. Engineers reassigned teams to inspection, while others were released early. The plant that had once symbolized endless motion began to slow. Even so, Sorensen pushed to maintain output for the Pacific. The B-24s were still needed against Japan, and Willow Run would finish what it started. When victory in Europe came in May, the celebration inside the plant was spontaneous and raw. Sirens wailed, tools dropped, and thousands of workers cheered together under the same steel roof. Some cried, others stood in silence. They knew that the war that had given them purpose was ending, and with it their extraordinary labor. For the first time in years, production paused for a single day. As the summer advanced, focus shifted to Japan. Production slowed but did not stop. Each Liberator that rolled from the hangar might still be needed for the final offensives. Then, in August 1945, news of the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender reached Michigan. Within hours, the machinery was shut down. The lights dimmed, and the endless hum that had filled the air since 1942 finally ceased. The silence was strange. Workers gathered outside the hangars, watching the last bombers gleam in the afternoon sun. There were no orders, no speeches, only the realization that their task, the greatest industrial campaign in history, was over. In the following weeks, layoffs came swiftly. Entire shifts were dismissed, cafeterias closed, and bus lines halted. The government canceled contracts, and the unfinished airframes were left on the floor. The city of motion became still. Temporary housing built for workers emptied as families returned home. What had once been a living organism of production now felt hollow. Ford Motor Company, burdened by years of wartime strain, began to transition back to civilian work. Henry Ford's health was failing, and control passed to his grandson, Henry Ford II. Charles Sorensen, who had spent years directing Willow Run, retired shortly after the war's end, leaving behind a record few could match, more than 8,600 bombers built under impossible deadlines. For the communities around Ypsilanti, the aftermath was difficult. The local economy, once driven by constant production, shrank overnight. Stores, schools, and hospitals faced closure. Some residents moved to Detroit or Toledo to seek work in peacetime industries. Others stayed, hoping the factory would find new life. In 1946, the complex was sold to Kaiser Frazer, which began producing automobiles under the same roof that had once turned out bombers. Yet Willow Run's meaning was not lost. Returning airmen often visited the plant, walking its empty floor with quiet reverence. Many had flown the bombers made here, some owed their survival to the strength of its rivets and engines. For them, Willow Run was not a factory, but a monument, built not of stone, but of labor. Its story captured the essence of America's wartime power, a democracy that could mobilize with precision and endurance equal to any totalitarian regime. The plant had proven that organization and determination could transform peace into strength faster than any enemy could react. By autumn 1945, the last bomber left the runway. Workers lined the field as it climbed into the sky, its 4 engines roaring across the horizon. There were no speeches or banners, only the quiet understanding that they had built something extraordinary. The war had ended, but the will that made Willow Run possible, the unity of purpose, the discipline of production, the belief that a free nation could build its own victory, would remain. In the months that followed, nature began to reclaim the edges of the airfield. Grass pushed through cracks in the concrete. The roar of engines faded into memory. Yet, for those who had lived it, the echo of Willow Run endured, the sound of rivets and turbines that once transformed a field of corn into a field of freedom. When the last bomber departed in late 1945, the vast halls of Willow Run fell silent. For the first time in years, the hum of machines and the clang of tools were replaced by stillness. The steel structure that had once symbolized the heartbeat of America's war industry now stood as an empty shell. Dust gathered where rivet guns once sparked, and sunlight poured through windows that had illuminated endless shifts. The war was over, but the question lingered. What would become of this monument to industrial power? In the months that followed, Ford Motor Company withdrew from bomber production and transferred control to the U.S. government. Wartime urgency had vanished, and the enormous complex, built for round-the-clock production, had little purpose in peacetime. Yet its meaning endured far beyond the final aircraft. For millions of Americans, Willow Run was the proof that the arsenal of democracy was more than a slogan. It was the embodiment of what a free nation could achieve when it turned its entire will toward a single goal. In 1946, the Kaiser Frazer Corporation acquired the property, hoping to turn the massive plant toward peacetime industry. For a brief period, new automobiles rolled along the same line that had once produced bombers. The pace was slower, the purpose different, but the sense of possibility remained. Later, General Motors took over parts of the facility for engineering and transmission work. Though the products changed, the architecture of ambition, that vast L-shaped building, continued to remind workers what had once been done there. Willow Run's greatest legacy was not measured in production figures, but in people. More than 40,000 men and women had built bombers on its floor. Among them were thousands of women who had entered heavy industry for the first time. They called themselves Rosies, and their labor changed the American workforce forever. When the war ended, many refused to return to pre-war roles. They had proven that precision, endurance, and technical skill were not bound by gender. The plant also transformed the idea of teamwork. Engineers, laborers, and managers from different backgrounds worked side by side under impossible pressure. The methods refined at Willow Run, modular assembly, flow production, logistics control, would later define modern manufacturing. These principles fueled post-war growth, shaping the automobile and aviation industries of the 1950s and beyond. Over the decades, historians called Willow Run the factory that won the war. Its scale and speed symbolized a new form of warfare, one fought with production charts, conveyor belts, and determination rather than guns alone. Presidents cited it as an example of what democratic organization could accomplish when guided by discipline and unity. The lessons learned there became part of America's identity, woven into every post-war assembly line. Though much of the original plant was later dismantled, a portion survived as the Yankee Air Museum, preserving the story of those who built the Liberator. Visitors today can still stand beneath its steel beams and imagine the roar that once filled the air. On display are photographs of workers, fragments of aircraft panels, and a single motto painted above the entrance. Through these doors pass the builders of freedom. The cornfields of Ypsilanti never returned to what they once were. The land had been changed, not just by concrete, but by history. From soil to steel, Willow Run proved that when democracy is tested, its greatest weapon is not force, but cooperation. It showed that victory could be built by ordinary hands working in extraordinary unison. In the end, Willow Run stood for more than bombers or factories. It was the moment when a nation discovered that freedom itself could be engineered, shaped on assembly lines, forged in discipline, and lifted into the sky by the people who believed it was worth building. When the final B-24 rose from Willow Run's runway in 1945, thousands of workers gathered in silence. For years, the roar of engines had marked time itself. Now there was only the sound of wind moving across the empty hangars. They had built bombers faster than any nation in history, and in doing so had turned an American cornfield into the forge of victory. The machines were shut down, the shifts dismissed, but what had happened there could not be undone. Willow Run had proven that unity and discipline could transform a field of soil into an engine of war. The same people who once built harvesters and tractors had learned to build aircraft that crossed oceans and crushed empires. In the years that followed, cars replaced bombers, and peace returned to the land. Yet every rivet, every bolt carried a memory of nights without rest, of hands blackened by aluminum dust, of a nation that refused to stop. Willow Run's echo never truly faded. It reminded Americans that strength was not born from conquest, but from the will to build. And when the next challenge came, they would remember what a cornfield in Michigan once proved to the world. Between 1940 and 1945, the Willow Run bomber plant became the largest manufacturing project of its kind in the world. The plan began in mid-1940, when the U.S. government searched for new partners to mass-produce the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Ford Motor Company accepted the challenge, promising to apply automobile-style production to aircraft for the first time. Construction began in April 1941 on a 1,000-acre stretch of farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan. Designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building stretched more than 3,500 feet, enclosing over 3.5 million square feet of space. The L-shaped design resulted from Henry Ford's refusal to build across a county line that carried higher taxes. Within a year, the building housed its own power plant, rail connections, and internal supply network, a complete industrial city under one roof. The first test aircraft rolled from the line in September 1942. Output rose steadily through 1943, reaching one bomber every 100 minutes. By 1944, Willow Run achieved Ford's original goal, one complete B-24 every 63 minutes. Over its wartime lifetime, the plant produced approximately 8,685 Liberators, nearly half of all B-24s ever built. At full capacity, Willow Run employed more than 42,000 workers drawn from across the Midwest. About one-third were women, many serving as riveters, welders, and inspectors. Work continued in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The surrounding bomber city housed more than 15,000 residents, schools, and transport lines built to support the operation. Each B-24 weighed roughly 36,000 pounds empty and carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1 1830 twin Wasp engines, it could fly 2,100 miles at speeds approaching 290 miles per hour. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, bomber production ceased. The plant was later used by Kaiser Frazer for automobiles and then by General Motors for engineering. Decades later, the site became home to the Yankee Air Museum, preserving the story of the workers who built freedom one aircraft at a time. Willow Run's timeline remains a record of transformation, proof that a democratic nation, united in purpose, could turn farmland into the engine of victory.